Great. So I should introduce myself. I'm David McKnight. I'm the Environment Programme Manager for Thames area in the Environment Agency. And I'm also the Project Executive for the Littlestock, Brook, NFM and WFD and many, many other kind of outcomes project. And then going across the slide, we've got Jo Old. She's the Project Manager for the EA side of the project and a catchment coordinator as well in the Environment Programme team. Moving across, we've got Anne Barclay. She's the project manager for this project at Wild Oxfordshire. We then move on to Richard Boddy. He's going to be presenting the modelling results that he and David Ramsbottom from HR Wallingford have worked on for the project. We've got John next, who's a PhD student with UK CEH. We then have Dave Gasker talking. He's going to cover off elements around the carbon, biodiversity net gain, natural capital assessments that have recently been completed for the project. We then have Chris Trotman. I nearly said Tim then, Chris. He's the chair of the parish council. And then we have Matt Childs, who's the farm manager of Bruin Estate. These are the speakers for this evening. But I guess it's fair to say that that's not all of the key players that have been involved in the project. There's been so many over the past 5 years who've had integral roles in delivering the project, who've been involved in the planning, the design, construction, and the monitoring of the project. Just to name a few, Hilary Phillips, who's on the call today. Gratitude to you, Hilary. You were around at the start of the project and before, obviously taking the role of the Catchment Partnership host. We have Anne Miller, we've got Richard Bennett on the line as well, I think, Vaughan Lewis, Lawrence King, colleagues at the Forestry Commission and Natural England, and many others, I think, far too many to name individually. But hopefully a few of them are on the call today as well. The delivery of this project has been through the Evenlode Catchment Partnership, which, as we know, is headed by Wild Oxfordshire, and Anne Barclay's currently the project manager and the host, really, for the partnership. It's been a local community invested and collaborated project from the start, really, and throughout, and going forward, I think, as well. It's fair to say that the 5 years is really the end of the capital side of the scheme and the delivery, but the monitoring and the evaluation and the ongoing and potentially other projects that come out of this will continue, and we know they've already started. Next slide, please, Anne. So I should just quickly say that just take a minute really to sort of celebrate the recent award that the project's received from the Environment Agency's National Flood and Coastal Excellence Awards. I guess if we need it, it's kind of quite nice formal recognition, not just of the outcomes of the project and what it's achieved, but the way in which it's been delivered. You know, when we saw the awards, it was striking. I couldn't believe we actually picked up the award for climate resilient places category, mainly because some of the other projects were huge multi-million-pound projects delivering many hundreds of houses and communities better protected from flooding. But you know, it was just such a heartwarming and proud moment that the project and all the people were kind of marked in that kind of nice way. And thank you so much for those on the line that have been involved in the project for your contribution. I think it's just a nice kind of touch to get that formal recognition really at this stage of the project, and the legacy of the project, as I said, I think, and what we hopefully leave the community with and the local environment will go on benefiting. Next slide, please, Anne. So just taking you back, move on, there we go. Just taking you back to the photograph, really, the big photograph on the bottom right. That's I don't think it's the peak of the flood in 2007, but this is back to 2007, and that's kind of what community are still in fear of. We met members of the Heath. That's that area there on the photograph just the other day, this week, and talk to them about the results and what we've been up to, and listen to their views on how it's been operating and working and how they feel about it. And they're still living with the fear of flooding. Of course they are, and that's something that we can't remove, that fear of flooding or that threat of flooding. It exists. The project, we'll hear more about that, goes some way to offset the impacts of flooding, delay the onset of flooding. But that's what we're dealing with. And back in 2007, I was standing in some of the residents after the flood, front rooms, and feeling and hearing the emotion, the sadness, the anger, and a whole load of other emotions too around what happened, what we could do about it, and that this is one small community of many, many communities across England that suffered flooding in 2007 and subsequent flood events, even recent, this Christmas just passed. So the threat's real, the risks are real, and the damages are significant. And it was a very difficult time back in 2007 where we were not able to identify, not able to demonstrate or justify the investment required to protect these properties and other communities from flooding, based on the current economic appraisal guidance that exists at that time and still exists now to a certain extent, albeit NFM is creeping into the toolbox. And we're looking hopefully through this project to start to kind of mainstream, and we'll talk a bit more about that in the results and the research and what comes from that in the future. So things were pretty bleak at that time, and the messages were quite difficult too. So going forward to 2013, CABA, the catchment-based approach, was DEFRA's sort of flagship launch of the catchment partnerships. And these catchment partnerships created this framework for collaboration to exist between the EO, who was seen as, the EA, who was seen as the responsible agency for flooding, and they'd have all the funding and the solutions, to a framework which involved local communities, ENGOs, and other interested environmental groups, on not just improving the environment, but on flood risk too. And that collaboration framework really sort of was the start of this project, because that collaboration, those partnerships, and those ultimately relationships between people rather than organisations really started to give some cohesion to a sort of joined up approach to all these individual issues, such as water quality or even recreation and public open space, trees, and all sorts of biodiversity. All these sort of disparate issues were sort of brought into one function, one area through the catchment partnership. And I think that collaboration allowed the conversations to happen a bit more in a coherent and joined up way. And so after some time, after the establishment of that, the project formally started in 2016. We pulled together quite an innovative and complex package of funding to demonstrate or to justify that we'd be able to do quite a big scheme, the first in Thames area, the first lowland NFM demonstration project. And we managed to secure £600,000 from various sources, including the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, local FCRM grant and aid money, money from the programme that I manage, which is effectively the WFD, or the Environment Programme, and a national pot of money, which was a very small amount, but part of the DEFRA government's £15 million to investigate NFM and see if it works. And so there we go. We were sort of born with quite a credible funding package to really take a look, experiment, try things out, and then build in, as we'll hear again later, some real scientific approaches to what we were doing, where we were doing it, and what the impact was. We were also collaborating with Thames Water, who have invested financially and with time, and a number of other contributors in terms of in-kind, and that can be things like knowledge, time, and just contributing to the project in a wider sense. So yes, the project started in 2016 and it finished effectively this March. It delivers significant flood risk benefits. So we'll go into what significant means, as well as delivering WFD objectives, wide environmental and social benefits too. Can you have the next slide, please? So just to sort of paint that picture a little bit and to save me talking a little bit more, what we're going to do is just play a 2-minute video, which was part of our submission for the Flood and Coastal Awards, actually, but I think it tells the story probably better than I can, and from different perspectives as well. So we'll just play that now. I'm David McKnight, EA Project Executive for this innovative NFM trial on the Littlestock Brook. In response to flooding, we worked with the Even Load Catchment Partnership, using local knowledge and hydraulic modelling to identify and deliver interventions in the landscape, and have evaluated their effectiveness in reducing flood risk.
I'm Jo Old, EA Project Manager. You are seeing some of the nutrient retention ponds, riparian tree planting and fill corner bunds in action after a heavy rainfall event. These interventions now provide 30,000 metres cubed of temporary flow storage and reduce the severity of flooding for 12 houses in Milton, and also deliver for water quality, biodiversity and recreation. We have utilised local contractors and locally sourced materials.
I'm Anne Barclay, Project Manager for Wild Oxfordshire. We have designed these interventions to maximise habitat creation and gains in biodiversity. These fields, reverted from arable cultivation, now provide areas of carbon sequestration.
I'm Matt Childs. This is footage I took showing my fields in flood, storing water to protect the village. These areas are integrated into the farm's higher tier stewardship scheme. All in all, it's been a very positive experience.
I'm Chris Trotman, Chairman of the Parish Council. From the start, the Council and the villagers have been very enthusiastic and supportive of this project. We have ended up with an interesting and beautiful amenity for the village and the reduced threat of flooding from the brook.
A monitoring network has provided evidence that these NFM measures are effective and also enhance the rural landscape. Through positive landowner engagement, NFM is now making a valuable contribution to Milton's climate resilience.
So I'm Jo Old, Project Manager at the Environment Agency, and I just wanted to give a bit of a context to the results and thoughts that you'll be hearing sort of throughout this session. So this is where the project is. It's on the 16-kilometre square Littlestock Brook catchment, a tributary of the River Evenlode, which then joins the River Thames just upstream of Oxford. The community at risk was primarily the 12 properties in Milton under Wychwood. So the NFM measures, which you saw kind of in the video just then, were focused in the upstream area highlighted within the red box on that map. Next slide, Anne. Please. Thanks. So the key first step in an NFM project is just talking to people, talking to landowners, to the local residents and to partner organisations. It's to understand the landscape, to understand kind of how the catchment operates and floods, and to understand the skills and objectives of partner organisations, which can be integrated into a project which can deliver not only for flood risk, but also water quality, the farm business, wildlife, carbon and recreation. And this is why delivery of natural flood management projects through catchment partnerships, like in the Evenlode, is a really ideal forum to do that. And you mustn't underestimate sort of how long this process of engagement, of talking to everyone takes. So I think we did a lot of engagement for probably a year or more before we did any construction. Next slide, please, Anne. Key second step is to walk the catchment with the farm manager and identify those wet areas and overland flow routes which could be slowed and temporarily stored by the NFM interventions. If you click again, Anne, please. So you could see on this overlay the green surface water flow pathways going across the fields, which then really matched with the red crosses underneath that Matt Charles, the farm manager, had marked up as wet areas on the Bruin estate. Next slide, please. But installing an NFM feature like this, Field Corner Bund, into the landscape where those red crosses and green pathways kind of cross the fields isn't as simple as it first seems. I've left all the logos on this photo to show the number of partners who worked together to plan and deliver just this single Field Corner Bund back in 2018. Next slide, please, Anne. And I think the key considerations that I'd like to highlight are, firstly, the need to sort of integrate the NFM measures within the farming business and agri-environment payment schemes to allow for both the initial delivery or construction of the features, which for us required really close working with Natural England, Forestry Commission and a Thames Water funded farm advisor, just to utilise all the grants that are out there. And also we consulted the Cotswolds AOMB to ensure we complied with landscape character areas. And the project has funded a maintenance agreement with the landowner for the duration of the project up to now, but ongoing maintenance will require flood risk measures to be funded through possibly ELM, the new agri-environment scheme, or an alternative source, and that still needs working out. Secondly, we need to consider public liability insurance. So we located NFM measures on agricultural business land holdings rather than land owned by private residents. There was an obvious difference in their tolerance for risk. So Bruin Estate already had a public liability insurance and viewed the woody dams and Field Corner Bunds as quite low risk measures. They thought, well, if there was a problem, they could go in and hoik them out, really. So it's a much different perception of risk. And NFM is great because it has that flexibility in where you can locate NFM measures. So it did allow us that freedom to select the most appropriate land holdings. And finally, 3, permits and land drainage consents. So the woody dams and the Field Corner Bunds did require an EA FRAP, a flood risk activity permit, when within 8 metres of the main river, including the outfalls from storage areas. But the Bunds didn't require planning permission. We agreed with the local authority that agricultural permitted development rights could be used, and this was a lot cheaper and a lot less time. But local planning authorities will have different opinions of what is required for different natural flood management projects. So I would really recommend to start discussions early and talk through your project with the local authority to give them understanding of what measures are being constructed in the landscape. The Bunds on non-main river didn't require a land drainage consent from the local authority, but the woody dams in the channel did. So basically, it was just highlighting the need to sort of allow time in your projects to go through these requirements. So that's me. So I'll pass on to Anne. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Jo. So just to give you a bit of background, I don't know if I've got an echo. So the NFM project was conceived through the Even No Catchment Partnership, and as the host, Wild Oxfordshire agreed to receive the funding and design and deliver the project. And I think at this point, the size and complexity of the project was not fully understood by Wild Oxfordshire, but it was conceived as a no-regrets project. So Wild Oxfordshire employed Richard Bennett as the NFM project manager to design and deliver the project in-house. And this was the start of 5 years of a changing design and delivery approach, which I'll now talk about. So there were 3 methods of design and delivery. We had the in-house design with the contractor constructing, consultant design, contractor constructing, and the last of all, in-house design with the landowner constructing. So I'll go through these. Wild Oxfordshire didn't have the resources to support Richard and manage the project and coordinate the ECP. So after delivering the first phase, I was employed part-time to manage the project. and coordinate the ECP. That obviously did increase the costs a bit, but we did successfully deliver the second phase of the build. But through that process, we realised the professional indemnity insurance wasn't fit for purpose, and this took many months to resolve. Eventually, we did get a broker who understood the nature of NFM work. But throughout that process, the flooding and risk and the perception of risk for a small charity became a real issue, and the trustees were not happy with their personal exposure, especially as the bunds remaining to be built were closest to the village. So the trustees said no more in-house design. So we went to HR Wallingford because they were already partners in the project, modelling the project. And we thought there'd be additional benefits in fluid discussions between the modelling and the design processes. And based on our original low-tech design, HR produced more engineered design solutions. So during the design process, anxieties crept in over the plans for the largest water storage area in an old medieval fish pond. And we unearthed issues with a recent flood wall with unknown structure. Where it was sited, there was a stream running underneath it, and the total storage was coming up to 10,000 cube of water, which was rather close for us to the Reservoir Act limit. So it was decided at that point to leave the bund out. HR did run a catastrophic cascading fail test in the bunds and found that it made very little additional impact to the flooding in the village. So phase 3 was delivered successfully last year, but by then, or during that process, Wild Oxfordshire trustees had already decided they didn't have any appetite for any further engineering works. We also found that by now we are running out of meaningful places to construct storage water bunds, and there were many more constraints in the upstream landholding. So we concentrated on water quality using surface water runoff points to locate nutrient traps and a series of linked new ponds picking up spring lines and surface water. And this was delivered by the landowner. So this is all very low tech, and we didn't have drawings. We had sort of areas or lengths, and really the landowner did the design as they went along. So lessons learned. The in-house design is the most cost-effective and agile way of delivering NFM, but it does need to be weighed up against the perceived risk, and the risks have to be managed. Small charities need to have their trustees wholly behind the project. The more engineered approach is accurate and efficient, but much more expensive. So this route of delivery gave us less bund for buck. And when flood risk increased, then a consultant designing was a much more comfortable option. And the landowner delivery works at a smaller scale and works well. So moving on to the bund design, the top design here is Richard's design, with the outlet pipe wrapped in terram and free-draining stone, which is actually higher than this sump area that's dug out to construct the bund and forms an area where the sediment can settle out and not go down the pipe. The HR Wallingford bund design, the drain, which is exactly the same type of drain, is actually sat, as you can see, at the ground level at the foot of the bund. So there's no sump for sediments to fall out. So the interesting thing is that Richard's bunds hold water for longer and for varying durations, and some have actually developed aquatic flora or ephemeral wet habitats. And in arable fields, it's meant that these areas have to be taken out of production and either left as grass and wildflower or simply wetland. And the silt will need to be removed to maintain the sumps, and we're hoping that the monitoring work will give us some idea of how frequently this will need to be done. And in the pastoral fields, you do get a wetter area, but generally the grass manages to colonise unless the water's standing for much of the year, which you see in this picture here. This is our accidental pond where we cut through some field drains, and it just remains all year now. I mean, in contrast, HR Wallingford's bunds will drain down completely, leaving the available storage water area at a maximum. In the pastoral fields, this will not be disturbed again. It's a bit of a distant view of it, but the bund is this lighter green at the back. And you can see that, this meadow will remain undisturbed, and also it's quite coarse, so it will pick up a lot of the sediment. In contrast, the arable field needs to have a skirt of permanent grass that has to be established in order to trap the sediment before it's being piped away. And it is early days yet, but as the soil dries quickly, we don't expect to see aquatic flora and fauna colonising. And we also don't understand how much more sediment will be mobilised back into the brook with this type of method. So to conclude, lessons learned, or are they just decisions? So you could either go for a mosaic of wet habitats or efficient water storage and release. And really, it's a matter of tailoring your NFM scheme to fit your needs. Thank you. I'll hand you over now to Richard Boddy from HR Wallingford.
Right, good evening, everybody. My name is Richard Boddy. I'm from HR Wallingford, and I'm going to be talking about the modelling of Littlestock Brook, as well as the catchment, as well as the design and construction of the bunds. So if you could take me on to the next slide, please, Anne. So I was just part of a team. My role, along with that of David Ramsbottom, was all about looking at the flood risk analysis, doing the modelling, and in the case of David, he focused on doing the benefits analysis. In addition to myself, we had Manuela Iscaramaya and her team in the engineering division or engineering group, and they were looking at the design and construction of the bunds, and then when it came to the tendering process, they managed that, and then they supervised the construction. So if we can move on again, please, Anne. So to talk about the modelling, our model was a purely 2D model. So the idea here was to apply direct rainfall to a 2D surface and use that to work out where the flow paths on the fields existed and where we could best situate or site interventions. So where field corner bunds could be used to intercept those flows. And we modeled both the existing measures. So by the time we came along to this, the measures in areas 1 and 2 and 3 and 6 and 7, I think, had all been constructed. And what we did is we modeled those as well as, if you like, the bare earth, so removing those measures. And then also when we came to the final phase, those new bunds. So for each of those, we were able to understand the comparative benefits of applying these natural flood measures to the site. The flood modelling was done using the InfoWorks ICM software. This is an industry standard application that is used for modelling catchments and assessing flood risks. And it's a tool that we're very comfortable using at HR Wallingford. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Anne, and if you could click through. So to try and understand the model a bit better, this is a representation of the 2D flooding, and here we're looking at area 3. Okay, and if you click on the first thing, then Anne, so the mesh, the triangular mesh that you can see, that represents the topography. So that's capturing the land surface, and it's the bare land surface, so without any buildings or anything else on it. And if you click again, please, Anne. So what we've done, as I say, we modeled the whole thing in 2D. So that included representing the channels in the 2D mesh. So if you had very good eyesight and you could zoom in, you could be able to see there were little triangles representing the channel. Okay, and if you click again, Anne, what we can see as well is around the bund area, so this is area 3, again, we've got greater detail, trying to capture the flow paths as the water comes out of the channel. And then again, Anne, if you could click on, we also include in our model any structures that intersect that are in the channels or in block flows. So here we have a culvert, and this culvert allows flow to pass through from the upstream of the bund to downstream of the bund. This particular bund is unusual in that it straddles across the watercourse. Most of the bunds are field corner ones. But we also have in the model the woody dams. We have the driveways around around the Milton under Witchwood, as well as any road crossings that we have as well. Okay, if you click again, please, Anne. And as we were also wanting to understand the benefits, we also included some results points that enabled us to see the water levels and flow rates around the various houses. Okay, could you click on again, please, Anne? So a crucial outcome of this model is, from our perspective, was showing that the measures actually reduced the flooding in Milton under Witchwood and being able to quantify that reduction. Using the completed model, we could then identify the potential locations of additional measures and to support the engineering team in their detailed design. The various phases of the model allowed us to quantify the benefits of the existing and proposed measures on the properties in Milton under Witchwood. And usefully going forward, the principles from the modelling can be applied in other areas. So the key understanding here is knowing the volume of water that can be contained behind the natural flood measures against the flood volume that would normally be in the channel and on the floodplain, and understanding how the measures reduce that volume at the properties. Okay, could you move on again, please, Anne? Thank you. So once the model was completed, we were then able to use that model to support our engineers. So in consultation with Wild Oxfordshire and the landowner, our engineering team investigated the options for the bunds. So in this case, we were looking at areas 4 and what's called Little Meadow. So area 4 is downstream of that fish pond area that Anne mentioned in a previous talk, and Little Meadow is well, it's a meadow, it's little, and it's upstream of that fish pond. So in those two locations, our engineering team created some concept designs for the two bunds, and this design included the overflow spillways and the drainage options, as well as sourcing the material for those bunds. And among the design criteria that we had for those bunds, we had to have a maximum height of the bunds of 1.2 meters, and we needed to have mild slopes. So, 1 in 12 was the sort of maximum slope that we wanted to have here. And the reason we had those two criteria was ideally to have the bunds blend in with the natural environment, as well as making them relatively safe. And so you don't have a deep volume of water, and they're not something that someone could tumble off. And lastly, as Anne has mentioned, we've got this maximum water volume. We wanted to keep any volume stored behind those bunds to less than 10,000 cubic meters. And the reason we did that is because we expose those bunds to the Reservoir Act, and again, that would add an additional complication. Okay, next slide, please, Anne. So the final stage, once we'd gone through the concept design, was to develop those into detailed designs and detailed drawings. So again, our engineering team were able to come up with bills of quantities and come up with detailed drawings. These were translated into construction specifications. It then went out to tender, and HR Wallingford supported Wild Oxfordshire in the tender process and the selection of the contractor. Once the tenderer was appointed, we then supervised the construction of the bunds, and then were able to hand everything over. And I'd just like to stress a point here. Really, natural flood management it's a growing field. It's very I think it's very important, but it's one of those ideas that's got to be underpinned by sound practice to make sure that what we're delivering is safe, because it's going to minimise that risk to both the landowners and to the general public. So that's me. Thank you for your time. I will now pass you on to John Robotham.
Hi, so I'm going to be presenting a bit of a whistle-stop tour in terms of the monitoring that's been going on in the Littlestock Brook. So I'm presenting this work on behalf of myself, James Bishop and Emily Trill, and many others that have contributed towards this. Next slide, please, Anne. So on this slide, we've got an overview of all of the different types of monitoring kit that we've installed and have been logging over the past few years. So crucially, we've been monitoring stream flow at 2 sites at the bottom end of the catchment by the heath that you've seen earlier. And then we've also had turbidity sensors go in and water quality sondes measuring a whole suite of different parameters. We've had in-stream water level sensors, and as well as monitoring the water level and volume stored in various flood storage features. We've also been measuring rainfall and soil moisture, and there have also been time-lapse cameras taking hourly photos of some of the features. In addition to that, we've been doing sampling, so things like water quality spot sampling, stormwater sampling using automatic samplers, sediment trap sampling in 3 ponds, and also sediment coring and surveying in the various flood storage areas. Next slide, please, Anne. So now on to some of the initial results of the work that was being carried out by James, and some more recent analysis that Emily has undertaken, looking at the flood storage in the different features. So we observed a whole range of different events over the past few years, with a return period of up to 5.5 years in the largest magnitude event. And this table below shows the largest 6 events during the monitoring period. And the great news is that in all of them, there were significant reductions in the flood peak observed. The NFM scheme also shows potential for flood attenuation in large magnitude events, as there's still significant storage volume that's remained unused during these monitored events. And there's also a positive result in terms of how the features drain down. So we've observed that they drain down sufficiently to allow storage for a potential next event that may be coming through the catchment very soon. Next slide, please. So I don't know whether this will work, but you should be able to see the animation on the right from one of the time-lapse cameras showing the filling and draining of one of these flood storage areas. And this was during a quite large event that we had just before Christmas 2020. And then you can also see from the graph on the left how the volume stored by the flood storage areas cumulatively increases up to the flood peak, at which point they stored 26% of the flood peak volume. Before then, 3 hours after the peak, they started to drain water back into the brook. And then during this event on the 14th of November 2019, cumulatively, the flood storage areas held over 7,000 cubic meters of water at their peak storage. Next slide, please, Anne. So the other focus of the monitoring was looking at the water quality side of things, particularly some online pond features, which you saw earlier from the YouTube video and some of that drone footage. And these features acted as wetlands, helping to reduce the nitrate, phosphates, and suspended sediment concentrations during base flows. And then as well as that, during some of the storm events, the ponds were able to reduce these intense peaks in suspended sediment concentrations, as shown on this central graph, with the flattening of this sediment curve as you go downstream from the top of the ponds to the bottom. And these ponds also created great habitat diversity within what used to be an arable field. And I recorded 31 plant species and 22 aquatic invertebrate families just in these 3 small ponds alone. And that was things like mayflies, dragonflies, damselflies, just to name a few. Next slide, please. So overall, the ponds and storage areas trapped an estimated 87 tons of sediment and 128 kilograms of phosphorus since their construction, and that equates to about 15% of the overall sediment flux that leaves the Littlestock Brook. We found that the design features can strongly influence the trapping rates, particularly in terms of things like their width to length ratios, with longer features allowing more settling of sediment. And also the maintenance requirements vary between features, particularly things like the online on-stream features capture sediment quite rapidly and so do require maintenance every couple of years, whereas some of the larger bunded features are more hands-off and so may only require maintenance, say, once every 10 years. And then I've also put on this slide a recently published paper, so there's a lot more information in that, and there's a link to that on the slide as well. Next slide, please. So lastly, I just wanted to talk about some of the lessons that we've learnt from the whole monitoring experience. A big one being that collaboration with partners has been just really valuable in getting the monitoring going and making the most out of the monitoring and the data. So working with the team at Atkins or the EA National Lab Service or Thames Water Meteor Communications, just to name a few really. And then also having telemetry and access to live data has been really valuable to us to be able to see when we might need to rush out to do flow gauging and sampling, but also it's been really valuable for the community themselves, particularly the residents of the Heath being able to see that live monitoring data coming through. Also, choosing monitoring sites carefully has been really important to try to avoid issues like gauging flows when they're going out of bank or having sensors out of the water in shallow stream sections. Additionally, getting the monitoring in place as soon as possible will help to yield better data, particularly if we're wanting to compare before and after the NFM implementation. Those understandably can be a logistical challenge trying to get all of this monitoring going. And lastly, it's important to say that at some point in the field, things do go wrong when you're dealing with lots of different sensors, especially when they're exposed to all of the elements. And like in this bottom photo, mice decided to inhabit a sampler and chew through cables and things. So you really have to prepare for the unexpected in the field and to be able to adapt to different situations. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you for listening. And next, I'm going to be handing you over to Dave Gasker.
You've heard about quite a lot of people sort of talking, John's just given a lovely description of the water quality side of things and some of the flood risk elements. And I think in the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to talk a bit more about the sort of general multiple benefits that we think that the scheme has provided. And just to pick up on something David said right at the beginning, which is around this whole concept of experimenting as well. So a lot of the things that you've heard about are relatively new, and it's part of a sort of a piloting approach, no regrets, as Anne called it initially. And the one reason to look at multiple benefits itself is obviously the initial objective of this scheme was all about flood risk management. And so there's a team that you will see here that have been thinking about some of the other benefits that the scheme has provided. And this is particularly important in terms of lessons learned, because as we move forward, and as David McKnight implied at the beginning, funding is key for all of this. And funding purely on the basis of flood risk management may not always be available. And so thinking about multiple benefits up front helps to identify ways to co-fund some of these projects. And I think this field is one that's rapidly emerging at the moment in the even load catchment and beyond. If we could have the next slide, please. So, the NFM scheme, it was all about protecting properties from flooding, and the work that HR Wallingford have done has shown and that John has reflected on as well, has shown that in total 12 properties have been protected from flooding at certain return periods by this particular project. Next slide, please. But in doing some of this, and having worked through and observed the changes in the landscape, we're also aware that there's a whole host of other things that have been delivered. I think John made that lovely point around the damselflies and the dragonflies, the biodiversity elements of some of these schemes, and I think that was also touched on in terms of how you might want to design a bund. Do you want it to retain water, or don't you want it to retain water? We've talked about the water quality, but a really important driver at the moment is obviously we're in a climate emergency. Everything we do has to seek to be as carbon neutral as we can make it. And we need to understand, not just for that purpose, but also to enhance the ability to fund some of these schemes, what the climate regulation potential is, how much carbon can we lock up, and also to think very carefully about the amount of carbon that we use in, say, constructing or maintaining some of these schemes. There's a lot of discussion around air quality as well, for example, at the moment. So Natural England have national initiatives to reduce the amount of ammonia and nitrous oxides in the air. And the types of activities that NFM delivers can help with those. And then last but not least, the ones in white at the bottom here, these social services, the things that, we all enjoy going out and using these spaces. There's the educational potential and the knowledge exchange that we're able to do, like we're doing this evening, just to encourage others or support others in whichever way to do and deliver NFM schemes elsewhere. Next slide, please. So all I've chosen to do is just to share with you some of the outputs of a natural capital assessment. We've looked at each of those ecosystem services that I've previously described to actually attempt to tease out and quantify what the actual benefits actually are. And so I'm just going to, obviously, the key metric here is the 12 properties that have been protected. That is what the flood risk objective of this project actually was. But in doing that, once you start drilling down to the detail of some of these other services, we have some very, very significant benefits. And in some cases, actually, interestingly, when we look at them, they are as important or as the flood risk benefits they provide. And so the carbon side of things, the construction and maintenance of this scheme, we estimate will take about 159 tons of carbon. But by 2100, the scheme as a whole and all the habitat it's created will deliver way over 8,000 tons of CO2 sequestered. In terms of biodiversity, I think various people have raised this. There's a very big driver at the moment from UK PLC around biodiversity net gain. We estimate that the scheme has delivered 127 biodiversity units, so that's an increase of 30% of the biodiversity value of this land holding as it is formally measured currently. John has talked a lot about the water quality benefits as well. And they're very significant air quality benefits that have been delivered too. Next slide. But I think one of the sort of real lessons learned, if we talk about this, is what I've called here social value. And I think, as a team, we've always been very interested in making sure that people come out to see what's going on, that any information that's made available is shared. And also some of the sort of science and research and side of things, which I've called education in this sense. You can see we've got 3 PhD students who are actually researching this particular site. It's supported or featured within 3 national science initiatives. We've had international scientists visit the site and other types of research staff involved. Some of these features are built on public rights of way and so on. There's some fantastically used spaces near Milton under Wychwood. And we estimate that probably an additional 5,000 visits per year are made to that particular area of land or the scheme as a whole, where those public access exist, purely on the basis of the additional interest that those new landscape features will provide. And I think knowledge exchange has been a huge element of this, but very much in the ethos of the project. It's, you know, trying to share all the knowledge that everybody has obtained. There's been at least 500 knowledge exchange visits from what we've been able to quantify at the moment. I suspect that is an underestimate. There's been 4 conferences, 4 volunteer events, and a very large amount of training, which hopefully, certainly I know in a couple of instances where it's directly contributed to other NFM schemes that the Environment Agency is involved in. And just to finish, I guess, you know, picking up on something Simon said here about, you know, lessons and choices and opportunities. I think as we move forward, thinking about some of these ecosystem services early will help to design these types of schemes, maybe slightly differently, maybe the same, but thinking about this and having the tools as we do now to do that is going to be very, very helpful in sort of maximising some of the benefits that these types of schemes will deliver. And just to say finally that, you know, we can actually put financial values now onto some of these numbers, and that's kind of in the process of doing that at the moment. And that type of information is what we would then use to seek funding for some of these things early doors. So understanding these types of things early is not just about influencing the design, it's also to help other local communities unlock funding for similar schemes. And that's it, I think. Final slide. I haven't got a lovely Twitter tag like John does. That's fantastic. But yeah, thank you very much.
Well, first of all, on behalf of the parish, I would like to thank David, yourself, Anne and Joe and all the team for putting together a scheme which, as you say, has protected 12 houses. In fact, it's protected more than 12 houses because there are other houses downstream before Littlestock Brook enters the Evenlow, which have also had partial protection. It's been a fascinating scheme. To start with, we just wanted to stop the flow of water. But what we have learnt through the past 5 years about the catchment of sediments, the phosphate and the nitrates, and the planting of woodlands has been an amazing experience. We've involved the whole village. They really got into the tree planting, and we planted over, I think it was 200 trees in total. And surprise, surprise, about 99% of them have survived. So that's good news. We have replaced 1 or 2, but not many. The community came out. They've actually tagged each of their trees with their name, and quite often they come back and have a look at them and say, oh yes, my tree's growing nicely. They can't remember what it is, but it's growing nicely. We also, they come back and have a look at the spiling, which again was a totally new experience for us. And I think the biggest thing they enjoyed about that was actually jumping into the brook, all against David's advice that no, you mustn't go and play in the brook, and creating a lot of splashing and having a wonderful time. So it's a project that not only has benefited the village as a flood risk management, but it's also increased the knowledge that we have about how the environment impacts on a village. And we are very keen to carry on with this project in the years to come. We know a lot of the monitoring device that the EA put in has come into the end of its life, but we are negotiating with Matt Dibbs of Meteor Communications to replace some of the monitoring equipment so that we can carry on keeping an eye on Littlestock Brook, which quite often is a benign brook that you think that can't do any damage. But if you get a flash storm, oh boy, does it come up quickly. So again, I just repeat what we say. Thank you very much to the team and all those that have been involved for helping to protect our village. It's been a fascinating experience. Thank you.
Dave, I don't think. Thank you, Chris, actually, for that. You know, your comments, you know, mean for the most, you know, because it's actually, you know, you're living there and you're actually experiencing and seeing the differences that that have happened over the last 5 years. So yeah, and I went along to the willow spiraling and the tree planting, and it was just really, really good to see all the community out there. And I think there was a local cub group as well, wasn't there? So yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. I don't think Matt Childs, the farm manager, has been able to join us. I think he's busy with harvest. So yeah, Dave McKnight, it's back to you.
Thank you all. Thank you for presenting. We have kind of gone over our allotted hour, but I'm happy. I think the presenters, most of them are happy to hang on a little bit. If there are any questions, points of discussion, observations, anything that anyone wants to raise now. I think Dave Gasker's nicely answered the question on the chat function from Simon. I think just the one point I'd add to that is, yes, at the outset, NFM for us has always meant it's more than flood risk. For me, it's really around, you know, the three broad components of habitats and biodiversity, and that goes hand in hand with NFM really, and the flood risk component. And water quality has been central at the outset of this. I think the point we were making earlier is around the fact that the opportunities that come through the delivery of the project over a period of time, being a demonstration project, and the flexibility that Anne and I think Joe talked about around where you can locate these within the landscape, brings you opportunities that you might not have envisaged at the start. And then Dave brought that nicely to conclusion with the assessments that we've been doing, that he's been leading on around looking back. So you can't always look forward and understand everything you want to deliver, but when you get to the end and look back, you pick up all of those extra elements and value those as well. So that's great. Are there any questions? Does anyone want to use the hand function to raise a hand if they've got a point or a question or anything, and we'll try and pick that up, or feel free to dial out if you've got dinner waiting.
I think Hillary's the first cab off the rank with a question.
Couldn't see any, but go for it, Hillary. Yes.
Although you need to unmute yourself.
You're on mute. I didn't want to say that, Richard.
I've been avoiding it.
Isn't it? I just want to say it's fantastic to see this come to completion, to see all the work that's gone into it and all the benefits that have come out of it. And I'm really chuffed to have been in there at the beginning. But I want to ask what's next. Yes, you've stopped creating flood storage areas around that site. Are you carrying on with the monitoring? If so, how long for, and who is taking charge of that? And are you planning to move to any other areas in the even low to put into place what you've learnt at that site?
Okay, I'll answer a bit of this and I'll pass to either Joe or Anne to pick up where next. The learning, the evaluation is ongoing, and that will continue. The investment on the ground has stopped, as we've said. Mm-hmm. The research, when we can bring that together, is going back into the national DEFRA-led 15 million scheme evaluation to look at how we can how good is NFM and how can it be mainstreamed, or can it? In my view, it will be part of the toolbox. It will be part of the selection process, not necessarily standalone. In some locations, it might work standalone. In others, part of a hybrid scheme with more sort of traditional engineering. So the work we've done goes on in terms of the learning and how that can then inform the way NFM works in terms of the cost benefit analysis used to demonstrate economic viability. So that's the kind of one part. But back to the even load in terms of what happens now. Joe or Anne, do you want to just explain? You're on mute as well.
Sorry. Yeah, so we are looking at other communities that could benefit in the upper even load. That's where the flashy clay soils are. So there are localities such as Beddington and Morton in the Marsh, which have a lot of catchment area upstream. But yeah, it's starting, putting all those partners together. The local authorities are, Gloucestershire County Council are looking into it as well. So yeah, hopefully it will be able to be replicated, and that's the whole idea of this project. It was a trial that could hopefully be replicated, but yeah, it's getting all those partners and funding packages and doing all the talking that I sort of outlined at the start. Those steps do take time. And I don't know if you want to add as well.
We're also looking in a slightly smaller scale with a river restoration project, which actually could benefit some NFM as well. So we're not just looking at the larger communities, which is helpful.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
And just to add, the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, who part funded the project from the outset, have been clearly really interested in the evaluation of this, and we're working with them still in various groups, looking at priorities, looking at how we understand NFM from a mapping point of view. So there's been some work going on there. They're very interested in supporting and identifying additional projects that might benefit too. So there's, till the bigger beast and the machine catches up that we're feeding into, there's still a lot of focus, and we're being able to use the success of this project internally to help influence other project managers working on more perhaps traditional schemes to consider the more sort of the mosaic of approach that NFM brings, rather than the receptor approach of build a wall or fund or something else. So there's a number of routes. Nick, you've got your hand up. Nick, I can see that one at least.
Yeah, hi, thanks, David. Well, first of all, congratulations for winning that award. Yes. Big round of applause to all involved. Fantastic, and very well deserved. The question bit of it is, when you strip out all of the sort of, the research, the demonstration side of things, do you have a sense in terms of where we finally end up with that sort of economic cost benefit analysis in terms of protecting properties from flooding?
I personally believe my experience, and it's borne out through the modelling to a certain extent, is that NFM will be part of a solution. I think it will be quite unique where it stands alone and offers a high enough degree of flood protection. And that's partly because it generally is going to provide more benefit for low order, more frequent flood events, which is going to be harder to attach a generous benefit cost ratio to, and it's partly because of the level at which those solutions are working at, and the amount of flood storage that they can actually discount from the floodplain down at the receptor. So I believe that, the bigger the catchment, the harder it is, because the volume of water is a lot higher. The Milton under Wychwood catchment is quite small. It's around 16 kilometres squared. It's quite steep. It's quite easy, relatively easy. Richard, don't shoot me down. To map and to model and to understand, even though there's inherent kind of tolerances and judgments required. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be straightforward to make that linkage, but I think the techniques that HR will introduce and others are really, really beneficial tools that give us a really good steer on not just where but how much we can do, and then we can link that to cost benefit in a much more robust way. So I hope that the work we've done and others around the country that made part of the £15 million programme that's ended now have got some really good learning to help inform what that cost benefit appraisal looks like in the future. Because some projects, it's not good enough to just dig a hole in the ground and watch it fill up with water, take a photo and say it works. And the work that the PhD students have done as well, it's a two-pronged attack. It's looking at the monitoring of what happens and evaluating that, but actually the modelling as well. And those two things built together give us that much more confidence. And so that's where the project's been quite strong. And all of the interest that Dave, the figures that Dave Gasker just showed around how many people, how many engineers, how many project managers, different delegations have been interested in it to learn and apply it themselves. but the devil's in the detail. It's the so what question has to be asked, because after all, as Simon says, and we're very clear on that, this is public money, and we have to show public benefit. And NFM and again the natural capital approach and ecosystem services evaluations allow us to put more value on just on the whole project rather than just the flood risk benefits, which is the way we used to value schemes really. But now we've got this whole suite of different services that we can place value on, and they'll all help to give us a richer and more relevant cost benefit analysis in the future.
Yeah, here to that last point.
Just on the modelling there, David, and one of the things I would say is this is becoming quite common now. There's a lot of it. There's a lot of this sort of work about, and I think there are lots of efficiencies that will come with the territory. So things that we've learned we'll do more efficiently next time round. There'll be it will become. I think the modelling, which as David and Anne will know had its challenges, I think that will become easier in time. So
yeah,
and that just reduces the cost, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've all learned a huge amount. Let's pop to, I think, Richard Bennett. I think I saw your hand go next. If we go to you, Richard.
Yeah, sorry. Firstly, I want to thank all the speakers for the excellent summary of the scheme, and on all the elements of the scheme, not only the NFM but all the multiple benefits that it delivers, not only for flood risk but others. Well done everyone involved. It's really proud to be involved in from at the early days and see how it's developed and how things have moved forward. The one thing that I see from the scheme, a real benefit, is what the effect it has on flows downstream into the even load, and whether there was any summary on the flows, the reduction that it's had in different events. Can modelling be done to tell that from what's been built and see the benefit of that and the percentage of reduction? Because then because of the money that's been spent, and not only just for the flood risk but has delivered all these multiple benefits, is quite small compared to sort of the bigger schemes in cities downstream that have spent sort of multi-millions of pounds building, and with this, you can move forward and say, well, we could do it in another catchment and another catchment, and then the multiple benefit of that, the accumulation, surely you have a massive benefit and a much better spend of the money, rather than just being spent on the focus being on the big schemes downstream. Hopefully that's something that will be developed and in the schemes going forward and the further work that you do.
I'm going to say firstly thank you as well, Richard, for your efforts on the scheme. It feels like a long time ago now, but I can remember some of that trudging around in mud with you very well, and so it shouldn't be forgotten, your input into the project too. I'll say two things and I'll pass to Richard to talk about the modelling. Yes, we did look at the impact on the even load. It was very small in terms of benefits. Mainly, we're talking about scale of catchments here. The difference between Littlestock Brook being about 16 kilometres squared and the flow and the upstream catchment from the even load and the width of the floodplain at the confluence of the two all mean that the resultant benefits from the even load from the Littlestock Brook entering were very, very small in terms of the impact on the even load at that time. But anything else from you, Richard, on that?
Not really. I mean, we treated the even load as the downstream end of our model. It didn't have an effect. Even load didn't have an effect on us, and we didn't have an effect on the even load, I think is probably a fair summation. In terms of the bigger picture, I mean, doing those sorts of multiple catchments feeding a larger watercourse type thing, it's a different modelling approach to what we were doing. We were looking at a heavily detailed, highly detailed modelling approach. That's not feasible on something the size of, say, the catchment of the even load. You'll have to start looking at breaking down the individual, working out which catchments contribute and looking for where you might be able to obtain wins, and then do the detailed models on each of those bits, and then look at the sum of the parts, I guess, to see what the downstream benefit is. But as was said earlier, the bigger the catchment, the more measures you need, and it does become a bit of a beast, and just the nature of it. I mean, it's not my area, but because you're working with catchment partnerships, it becomes more and more complicated. So yeah, that would be what I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you. Let's move to Andrew Morsley.
Hi, just a quick question on the whole natural capital angle and the ecosystem services stuff. How do you envisage that the sort of the funding streams are gonna evolve in that direction? You've got, I think David kind of it kind of inferred that. Do you think things are going to change?
I think that they will. I think there's much more emphasis on that now, and already parts of the program in terms of the WFD program are funded and prioritized on the basis of the outcomes that the project forecasts. So that does happen. I think natural capital and other aspects give us a greater sort of a greater suite of measures to actually be able to attach benefit to, and therefore prioritize one project over the other depending on its likely outcomes. So yes, I think that is going to come. We already do it, but not to that resolution. So I think it gives us greater resolution. Could be quite a complex machine to actually turn the handle on that to get the answer with all of the different metrics. But yeah, I think that's possibly where we're going. Don't know how long it'll take till we get to the full natural capital suite of issues to measure. Dave Gasker, is there anything you can add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the obvious direction of travel, and I think, I mean, I'll be maybe a bit more positive than that and say that it's happening already. So one of the next schemes that we'll be developing on the even loads this year or next is co-funded by 3 different pots of money, partly on the basis of some of the services it provides. So I can see a situation certainly in the future where, maybe the Environment Agency has the overarching responsibility for flood risk, say, they would provide some funding to address that, but other bodies might provide some of the carbon or some of the biodiversity net gain requirements. And I think we're probably moving much more towards that sort of co-funded method for project delivery. But as David has said, you need the tools to be able to assess what those sort of metrics look like up front, and that's very much the objective that we set ourselves here. But yeah, watch this space, because I suspect it's going to move very, very quickly, and there are already big finance institutions in the even load and beyond who are thinking about what a financial model for some of these environmental futures might look like.
Is it important to get as much? I guess it's important to get as much data on those parameters early in the process, so you've got a comparative assessment, haven't you?
Yeah, it is. But I mean, there's lots of amazing projects like this happening all over the place that are collecting the data that help you to do that assessment. So the stuff I presented, that's a combination of lots of different people's work. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in the even load. I mean, if you think about carbon, for example, the Forestry Commission have a lovely tool that helps you evaluate the carbon credit that you get or benefit. And there's the same for biodiversity net gain or air quality or whatever you look at now. But the challenge, I think, for us as a group of people trying to encourage these types of things is to be able to bring it together and explain it in a way that a funder who probably isn't so fussed about some of the stuff that we are, understands the benefit in a financial way, and I think that's the barrier I think that we're overcoming at the moment, and I suspect will, as I say, move quite quickly.
Can I quickly reflect on that, and then I'll take my hand down, because David's just answered the question I was going to ask, which was about his assessment feeding into the appraisal, leading to co-financing. And it's happening, and I think I just need to reflect that looking from the perspective of other sources and funders as well, agri-environment, the discussions around ELM, net gain's already been mentioned a number of times. Co-financing is coming up in all of these funding sources. So building a project, seeking co-financing. Some of these other sources aren't particularly mature yet, but as a direction of travel to make more natural flood management happen, I think that's clearly what we're being pointed at, and achieving the multiple objectives. So it's a win-win. We could have more natural flood management and more of the other gains as well. So that's already answered my question. So I'll take my hand down.
Yeah, I guess my perspective is around this project and how complex and difficult it's been for us with the funding streams that I mentioned to actually demonstrate to all of the gatekeepers what the outcomes would be in terms of unlocking it. They all have rules, you know, lots of those were internal agency, 3 of them were agency funding streams with all different rules on different programs, one of which I manage and it has its own rules, own metrics, own justifications, own boards, everything else. So knitting that together, notwithstanding all of the external sources, was quite a challenge for us at the outset to do that. That's 5 years ago. You know, things are changing, and as we've discussed, you know, it's looking brighter. It's hopefully looking easier to do that. But it's it's a challenge to do that internally sometimes.
Is that a discussion that's worth sending up the line to DEFRA? Because it strikes me that Whitehall is the place to do that joining up, isn't it? Yeah. Ideally.
Yeah, it's understood. It's bigger than Thames area in this project for sure.
as an aside, at HL Wallingford, we did a research project for DEFRA looking at international examples of private funding for flood defences, coastal erosion, that sort of thing. So that was about 3 years ago. So yeah, certainly it's been asked at DEFRA levels. So hopefully,
yeah.
Again, it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, the partnership funding for flood defence has been around since 2012, and that was a very difficult position to move towards, and slightly different to what we're talking about. But willingness to pay has a big, you know, is a big bridge to cross, really. But this is slightly different because it brings, you know, people that are paying for a flood protection in terms of, you know, businesses, etc. You can't imagine how difficult it is to kind of unlock that funding sometimes to support the schemes. But we are moving forward for sure.
David, it'd be good to mention that it's a Thames Water smarter water catchment, and NFM is a theme within that. So over the next 10-year catchment plan, it is a theme which should attract Thames Water funding and match funding to the NFM. So it is starting to happen in that way as well.
Mm.
I think there's a question in the chat as well now. I think it's kind of asking the question whether we did it all retrospectively. So we've said about the multiple benefits retrospectively, but yeah, in terms of how we selected the Littlestock Brook as a project, it probably came to us really and came to the partnership from Chris Trotman and the parish council, because they were having a real issue with the flooding, and in particular the coarse material that was being trapped in the heath in the housing area of Road Bridge. So I think it kind of came from that sort of call for help really, and then when we pulled the project together, we didn't just consider flood risk. We also considered the other elements that had issues within the catchment. So that was the Water Framework Directive, water quality issues. So then we looked at sediment delivery and phosphate, which is how we have the water quality driver and the flood risk driver. So we did look at that, but we didn't look at everything that Dave Gasker talked about. That was done retrospectively. And I think going forward, it would be nice, as it was described, to design the project considering, you know, all of the benefits like we're talking now. Sorry, Dave, do you want to add anything to that?
It's a balance, isn't it, between how much time you spend planning a project and how and what the benefit and what's lost from having the flexibility and realizing opportunities as they come. I mean, when you lose the opportunity to work with the landowner in the way we did, you might lose the time, you might lose what's possible, you know, you might not be able to adapt quickly and flexibly. So that there is a balance. I mean, I'm not sure if we've got it right on this, but you know, there's something around being adapting and moving and picking up what you can as you go, against the time it might take to fully kind of map that out. And you know, we talked about, someone mentioned no regrets, I think it was Anne. You know, the project was certainly no regrets. There were some rules around it, as we said, about the funding. We needed to set out a business case. You know, it's a big amount of money. It had to go through assurance. It went through all of that based on the scope of the project, the likely outcomes, the risks, you know, the partnership, the collaboration, the legals, everything was built in at the outset. But there are so many fine outcomes and benefits that were kind of picked up along the way because of the agility of the project and the need for it to be flexible, to work within the landscape that is effectively a farm. So yeah, it's this tension that would be difficult when you talk to engineers about they want to develop a manual for NFM. You know, I start to get a bit worried, or I have done in this space that we've been in, and start to counsel quite hard that we should have some guiding principles of what we've learned, but we need to create some space to be able to be flexible and work with the landscape, work with the river corridor, because they're all different. And, you know, designing a woody dam to the nth degree might not be appropriate from one watercourse to another, and that's just one example. I mean, a lot of the NFM structures, not necessarily the bunds, but we even designed the bunds to be part of the fabric, if you like, of the landscape, so they fitted in. But also the woody dams, we expect, you know, we're trying to reinstate natural processes with a lot of these interventions, particularly the in-channel ones. So we're trying to, you know, they will be kind of form part of the riverine corridor event eventually. That's what we're seeing on the woody dams. They're silting up, there's more vegetation growing within them. You know, they are slowing the flow, excuse me. Okay, I can't see any more hands up or questions. Is that one from Dave down the bottom there?
I was just reflecting on I think it's quite an important point actually, is obviously that the funding models for all of this. I mean, I just wanted to really emphasize, David, what you just said. I think all NFM schemes should be flexible, actually. I think that's a lesson that I've certainly learned from being part of the process, and that you don't want to be too prescriptive if you can avoid it. But like you say, engineering requirements sometimes dictate that. All I was going to say really is that I think there's a really important role for NFM here around climate change adaptation, and that the funding models that we have now help us to protect communities at risk now, but they're not necessarily, you know, focused on what's going to happen in the future. So NFM is as much around being part of that basket of measures which bigger flood schemes in big cities, as Richard mentioned, will be a part of. But it does have to be part of that mix, because it's, you know, it gives us lots of other benefits as well. So sorry, I'll take that down now.
Well said. Yeah. Great, thank you. Great, thanks for your contributions. Thanks for the presenters, if you're all still online. If there aren't any further kind of comments or questions or anything, then I'll let you all go to the rest of your evening, and just say thank you once again for dialing in. Great to see you all, really good.
Thank you, good to see you again.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Bye.
Bye.